Hello, Indiana fans, and welcome to another Hoosiers Roundtable podcast. I am Brandon Brown, joined today by Todd Golden. And Todd, it's been 2 weeks. It's been 2 weeks since Darian DeVries has taken over. He is the new head coach for Indiana basketball after Mike Woodson's departure. And I guess kind of where are things? Where are things with Darian DeVries, the program? Just like what's the overall vibe 2 weeks in?
Yeah, well, last week was about where the former players, I should say, stood. Darren's first week was IU was on spring break, so there wasn't a whole lot that could be done. A few players were around. Two of them, Gabe Cupps and Malik Renew, went into the portal that first week, but a lot of meetings took place last week. And as we know, all of the players who could have come back, apart from Luke Goody, who we'll see if he can come back. That requires an injury waiver. So everybody that has eligibility is in the transfer portal. Now, not a huge surprise. I mean, that's just the way of the world in college basketball right now. A lot of players put themselves in the portal, especially this year, given, and we'll get into this a little later with the House settlement. But so DeVries gets the chance to build his own team now. I mean, he'll be able to throw in his own people. And this week is more about hiring staff and getting into the portal and getting some visits in. We know that Josh Dix from Iowa visited, Ryan Conwell from Xavier, also formerly of Indiana State. People here in Indiana would know him from there. And he's an Indianapolis native as well, have both visited. There are other visits planned, I'm sure, but so this week is more about moving forward. Last week was kind of about putting the past in the past. So we haven't seen anything today, but we'll probably not yet, but we'll probably see some movement this week in terms of filling out the roster. And we do know that Nick Norton will be joining the assistant coaching staff. Drew Adams from Cincinnati, the person I spoke with yesterday didn't want to make it official, but he's coming. So things are moving along, and that's time is of the essence. I mean, you're competing with so many different teams to get personnel and for coaches. So that's kind of where things are at with DeVries right now.
Yeah, it's interesting how you say it's just kind of the way of the world, and it really is. I mean, there was that graphic that went around before the Sweet 16 started where, players were – Purdue was the only school in the Sweet 16 that had 5 guys that started at Purdue in the starting lineup. Like, guys are just from all over the place, and the rosters are changing more and more, especially with a coaching change. You kind of almost expect that. I mean, again, my wheelhouse, watching Dusty May basically put together a brand new roster and do pretty well with it. It doesn't have to be alarming, but what does that mean? What do at a place like Indiana, lots of tradition, and is it just the old school way is just not a thing anymore, and it doesn't really matter if you're a blue blood or not? Like, this is just kind of how it is now.
Yeah, I don't think it's that way anywhere anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, even Purdue, since they were knocked out of the tournament, a few guys have gone into the portal that you wouldn't have necessarily expected. So, players have freedom of movement, and especially with the rules being what they are right this minute, they're going to take advantage of that movement. They should. I mean, what was it? I think it was John Calipari several years ago when the portal became a thing, said he would encourage all of his guys to go into the portal. Because why wouldn't you? I mean, especially if you're marketable and all of that. I mean, or if you feel like you're going to be in demand. I mean, yeah, there's certainly cautionary tales of guys going into the portal who came out the other end without a scholarship or with a worse situation. So it does take some intelligence to navigate it correctly. But I think we're even in the new era when you may start to see things more formalized after the House settlement, you're still going to have a lot of guys in the portal. And we got used to a system for 50, 60 years where people couldn't move and the system was illegal. So there's nothing illegal about any of this. Fans just aren't used to it. It's probably not good for the sport. But as the years go by, I think fans will get used to it. Here at Indiana, they've built through the portal the last 2 years in particular. So it's not that radical of a thing for the fans here. Now the turnover is a little bit more this year, but it's just the way people are going to have to get used to it if they want to, continue to follow college sports, which we'll see if they want to. I mean, that's interesting going forward to see what the market is going to be when players aren't sticking around for their careers.
Well, you mentioned Luke Goody briefly. What's the latest on him, as he is kind of the one little bit of a different case here with compared to all the other dudes on the roster who have just jumped into the portal with no other hangups?
There's no time frame on Luke Goody at this point. I mean, that's up to the NCAA. He wants an injury waiver for his sophomore season at Illinois. He played 10 games. In the old days, you probably wouldn't get it. These days, who knows? I mean, it's the NCAA seems to want to be approving waivers to avoid any kind of legal problems. So we'll see. Right now, the assumption would be, I would assume probably he might be back, but but we'll see how he fits in with whoever Coach DeVries gets. He likes shooters, so Luke Goody's was, especially in Big Ten play this year, was fantastic from 3-point range. So I would think he would be attracted to what DeVries wants to do, and but we'll see. I mean, that we may hear something in this month, but those injury waivers kind of happen when they happen.
Okay, and then what about anybody else? I mean, you kind of. It does happen, but you kind of assume that when a guy goes into the portal, he's going somewhere else. But there are cases where they jump back out of the portal and they stay put. Do you see that happening with any of the Indiana players, or is this going to be a completely clean house situation with a new coach and staff?
I mean, there's some players in there that you may want to have back. But a few have already announced that they're gone. Mackenzie Mbako is not going to be back. Malik Renew supposedly has 5 finalists, and none of them are Indiana. Although I think he would have done actually well in DeVries' system. The other guys, it's a question of whether you'd want to have them back. I mean, does Miles Rice fit what Darian DeVries wants to do? Maybe. I mean, there are certain attributes there, but that really depends on what Miles Rice, wants. Some of the other guys, I mean, I don't know. I think you can probably, without being mean to anybody in particular, you could probably find their skill sets elsewhere. So, the main guys who you would have probably wanted to have back, which would have been Mbako and probably Renew, are clearly not coming back. So I think it's a clean slate, and I think that's a good thing because new coach, new era. Just go ahead and make it a clean break. There's no need to what you're holding on to is a 19-13 season and a non-tournament season and a 10 and 2 straight 10-10 Big Ten seasons. So it's not like you're the players you're losing, with all due respect to them, didn't lead you where you wanted to be in the first place.
Sure.
So, I don't think it's that big of a deal. I know fans get attached to players, but most of the players they would have been attached to, their eligibility is gone anyway. So I think it's fine, and I'd like to see what DeVries can do in the portal with the resources Indiana has to throw at it.
Okay, all right, here we go. We're going to shift into something else here, and I'm going to need your expertise on this, Todd, because I even feel pretty uneducated when it comes to the house settlement and what all of that means and how it's going to affect rosters and what guys are doing and the timeline and all of that. It's again, just throw it into the massive pile of huge changes that are taking place across the landscape of college sports. So what is going on with that house settlement? Why is it affecting roster moves? What are players paying attention to? For all those out there who, I mean, I do this for a living kind of, and I don't even feel like I know what's going on. So I'm sure there's tons of fans who kind of feel a little lost with it still. So what's going on with that house settlement and how is it affecting what's happening right now?
Right. So rewinding it a little bit, because I know fans hear a lot about house settlement and probably wonder what it is. So they combined a bunch of court cases into one class action court case that came to an agreement. Basically, the NCAA and its schools and the Power 4 conference schools in particular were going to lose these court cases, and they were going to probably have to pay a sizable, and I mean like a fine that would pretty much cripple the whole enterprise of college athletics. So they combined several different suits into one, and they came to an agreement. The House settlement came to an agreement, which is what created this notion of institutions directly paying players. It hasn't happened yet, but it will happen starting next year. So that's the background of it. The settlement has to be approved, and that court case is scheduled for next Monday, April 7th. So what it will do is it creates the 20 million, approximately $20 million cap for the entire athletic department to spend. So that gets allocated over all of the sports. Most schools are going to spend most of that cap on football, and it's not, although there's still Title IX rules for the actual personnel, there's no Title IX limit on how you spend it. So like football spending doesn't have to be an equivalent elsewhere to football. So where this begins to affect everything, but basketball is probably the first. Basketball's portal happens right in the middle of this. If you agree to go to a school before the House settlement is settled, presumably next week, you can play by the old rules. So, for example, if IU gets a hot prospect out of the transfer portal and they want to pay him X amount of NIL between now and when the House settlement takes place, that's all fine. The old rules apply. If you sign somebody after the House settlement has been approved, you have to play by the rules. And the one thing I didn't mention is players will get paid directly by the schools. Collectives can still exist, and they can pay on top of that. However, those deals, anything above $600, it has to go to a clearinghouse, an NCAA-run clearinghouse. It's actually being run by the famous Deloitte firm. And anything above $600 has to meet market value to be approved by the clearinghouse. Nobody really knows what market value means yet. So Umar Ballo, for example, was allegedly making $1 million last year. Is that going to clear market value? I would guess, depending on how they define the market, you could question whether that would have been approved last year. So a lot of schools that want to get under the wire before these rules come into play. Basketball obviously is the most affected because they're in the middle of their portal. So that's where there's some urgency this week in terms of getting players on the dotted line, because if you wait until next week, you're going to be playing by the new rules and you may not be able to give them as much money. So, and the other thing that's going on, not necessarily in Indiana, but across the country, is a lot of basketball coaches are realizing that most of this money that's being allocated by athletic departments is going to football. So, you're hearing that, Kevin Willard complained about it on his way out at Maryland. There are schools that are having to make some tough decisions about where that $20 million cap gets allocated. So that's not necessarily a concern here. Indiana has committed to spending a bigger percentage of their cap on basketball than football, but it is a big concern at other schools, especially ones that are more football focused. So anyway, that's the background, and it creates a lot of urgency this week. It created urgency probably in the coaching search itself. I mean, apart from the fact you wanted a coach in before the portal anyway, you wanted somebody who could hit the portal early. So those are a bunch of the factors that go in with the House settlement as it relates to basketball, and it's having a pretty big influence. And we'll see how it works once it is implemented, because once again, we really don't know what fair market value means.
Yeah, man, a lot of moving parts, obviously. And one thing I just immediately thought of, and you kind of touched on it right there, is the quote unquote basketball schools could really do pretty well with this if they're going to say, we're going to like Duke is like a prime example. They have nothing going for their football program, and they are so basketball. I mean, compared to basketball
lately, I know what you mean, though. I mean,
compared to, they are a basketball school, and there's no argument. I mean, you would say Indiana's a basketball school too, but Cignetti is changing that a little bit. There's obviously some more excitement there. And then you think about the roster size. I mean, if suddenly that $20 million cap and $10 million of it's going to basketball, you really got 15 or 13 guys on scholarship as opposed to football where you've got 80 plus. And
I mean, it isn't going to be 10 million going to basketball. I mean,
I'm just throwing random numbers out there, right? But I'm just saying,
like, fans should know. I mean, it's probably, I would venture to guess it's going to be well under 5 million going to basketball out of the university's coffers. That's where the collectives are going to come into play.
Yeah.
It's an interesting dynamic because a lot of, as we're getting closer to the deadline, a lot of Power 4 schools have understood that dynamic too, and they feel like they're at a disadvantage in basketball. The Big East basketball schools, which that's basically that's their main sport, it's all they play, are kind of licking their chops a little bit. They know that at least early on, they're going to have an advantage because they can throw all of that cap at basketball. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic going forward. On the other hand, a lot of those private schools are going to have trouble just meeting the salary cap requirement. I mean, there's a lot of things going on outside of athletics that are affecting revenue, the enrollment cliff that you hear about a lot. Private schools tend to be a little bit more susceptible to that than big land grant public schools are. But so it's going to be interesting going forward to see where that kind of lays because, the way that house settlement is set up, you do, if you're a Power 4, you kind of got to pick, and that doesn't even count. Women's basketball doesn't count. Say you have a specialty sport, an Olympic sport that you're good at, Indiana, for example, is really good at swimming. Indiana's been good at baseball in recent years, softball. You think of like Iowa and wrestling, the hockey schools in the Big Ten, those programs, where do they stand? I mean, they're not revenue producers like football is. So that's all going to be very fascinating to see how that plays out as we get into the weeds of this, assuming the House settlement is approved, which there are a lot of objections to it. Most people assume it will be approved, and I would think it would be as well. But, I mean, there is the chance that it isn't approved, and then we're thrown into some pretty serious chaos because football teams signed players assuming the House settlement was going to be in play. So that's going to be, if for whatever reason it doesn't, it's going to be crazy to see what the ramifications are of that.
What a weird time. What a weird time to be covering sports, and especially if you've done it for a while. It's such a difference.
One thing people should know is that for the people who complain about NIL and transfer portal and stuff like that, that isn't going away. The House settlement would add at least a little bit of stability. So who knows how they're not contracts, but how the agreements would be set up between players and the schools. The schools are paying them. So you'd think the schools would have a little bit more of a voice than they do now in terms of how they would structure. Like scholarships are a year-to-year thing. Who knows how these new agreements are going to be set up? Maybe they're multi-year agreements and you have to pay a buyout to get out of it like a coach would. So we don't know that yet, but that's a possibility. But it should at least add a little bit of stability to the way, but not back to the way things were when it was just, year to year, 4-year type of thing. It's not going to ever go back to that. But this at least is a step in the right direction for providing some guardrails.
The toothpaste will never go back in the tube, as they say, nope. Todd. Not now. It's the floodgates have been opened. Well, you mentioned women's basketball a little bit there, too. Let's get an update on the Indiana program. Big-time players entering the portal there as well, including leading scorer Yarden Garzone. What's that mean for that program? I mean, how's women's basketball factor into all of this stuff? And just, kind of, put a bow on the Lady Hoosiers there as they wrap up their season as well.
Yeah, since we last podcasted, Indiana played in the NCAA tournament. They beat Utah in the first round and then played a competitive game against South Carolina in the second round. Ultimately, a rough third quarter cost them in a loss. Since then, a little bit more portal movement than I probably would have anticipated. Several players who would have been considered reserves, plus Lily Meister went into the portal last week. I mean, I was a little bit surprised, in particular, Alexis Bargesser, who has a really good role with Indiana, can play the point guard position, can play big minutes when needed, although has never been a regular starter. Very good on defense. They all went into the portal last week, and it was like, well, obviously they're doing a reset. Terry Morin had said that she wants this team to be quicker and more athletic, which they do need to be. Then yesterday, Yarden Garzone went into the portal. I was surprised about that because she's your leading scorer, 40% three-point shooter, so she's one of the best shooters in the country. So what seemed like it was going to be a lowercase reset is more of a uppercase reset in terms of where this team is going. The only players left on the women's team who have eligibility left are Shea Shesky, Lene Beaumont, who didn't play this year, she was hurt, and Faith Wiseman and Sydney Fenn, who was also hurt this past year. So that's it. Apart from that, it's going to be and the two freshmen they have coming in, Nevaeh Caffey and Maya Makalewski, both of whom won Miss Basketballs in their respective states. So that's good. But apart from that, it's going to be a hard reset, and we'll see how successful Terry Morin is in achieving the mission to get that team quicker and more athletic and bigger. We've never really been through this before with the women's program. They've been rock solid in terms of their personnel over the last half decade or so, with one class flowing into the other. And in a way, they were kind of like Purdue on the men's side, where they had a lot of stability. They did bring in portal pieces to fill in, but this will be different. This will be building the team through the portal to a large degree. So we'll see. It's uncharted waters for the women and for Terry Morin, who is obviously on board with doing it this way. So we'll see what happens with that. It'll be fascinating to see how successful they are.
So pretty big resets on both the men's and women's side of things for basketball. Different reasons, obviously, but nevertheless, I mean, if you go through and count them up, there's not even a lot of scholarship players in the Indiana basketball world right now. And you mentioned it's transfer portal, it's NIL, it's the settlement thing. It's just kind of the way it is now. How do you think all of that affects the fan interest? I mean, I'm getting there, but I don't consider myself that old. But I just remember when you had these players that fan bases would just latch onto and love up for 4 or 5 years, and they became almost the face of the program. And you're just not going to see that anymore. I mean, it's going to be so rare for one player to stay put for 4 or 5 years. What do you think that's doing to the fan base, specifically at Indiana right now, with so much change happening?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of sentiment against it. Against the changes. I could sit here and make all day and make a legal argument about why all this is happening, and I'd be right. Obviously, the courts have decided that it's right for players to be able to move around at will, for players to be paid. But from a fan's point of view, that runs so counter to the way college athletics worked for so long. I mean, it used to be, the example that most Indiana fans could identify with, and it was in the Season on the Brink book, is back in the 80s when Steve Alford posed for a charity calendar and he got suspended for a couple games because of it, or a game, or whatever it was. That's how serious it was back then, how draconian it was in terms of what you could not do. And, a lot of fans have had to first wrap their mind around the fact that a lot of that stuff is permissible now. So that was a big change. And the transfer portal, I agree with it. I think players should be able to move around the way they want to, like any other coach could, or any other student could. But is it good for the game? I'd say probably no. I mean, there's a reason why pro sports don't have full free agency every year. Marvin Miller, the famous baseball union leader, Major League Baseball owners, I think at one point during the negotiation over when free agency started back in the 70s, had proposed to have free agency every year. And Marvin Miller was smart enough to say, no, we don't want to go that far, because he knew that for his players, this is a little different argument, that with a limited market, the demand is higher for players. This isn't the same argument, but when the whole everybody can go in at once and nobody really has any stability in terms of who's where and all of that, yeah, I could totally sympathize with fans who don't like it. I mean, it's too much churn. So I think the House settlement is a step in the right direction in terms of um, stabilizing things. I think the next step, and a lot of fans don't want to hear this, but is going to be collective bargaining, which basically in effect makes it, an employee thing. And I think fans have to accept that that's the way it's going. I mean, it's not going back. So I see a lot of comments on our, when we post stuff on social media stuff, like the NCAA needs to rein this in. The NCAA has nothing to do with it. I mean, this is all court cases that allowed this to happen. Then the NCAA can't stand in the way. They need to eliminate the transfer portal. Well, that ain't happening. They need to eliminate NIL. That ain't happening. So will that turn some fans off from college athletics? Probably. I don't think there's any question about it. Which you start to get into, where the college fathers need to kind of, mothers and fathers need to kind of come together is to decide not what's good for them, but what's good for the sport overall. And I don't think we're anywhere near close to that. I think everybody's out for themselves in terms of the conferences, the schools, and you understand it because there's a lot of money at stake, but that money isn't going to be at stake in perpetuity if they can't get their act together and, create a system where there is some stability in terms of what the product is, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's an entertainment product. And if people aren't entertained by it, all that money that you're making off of it right now that you're rolling around in is not going to be around that much longer. So, I mean, that's not imminent or anything like that. And the truth is, for all of the fans who complain about the way things are, the people who actually donate money and want to make this happen are contributing just as much as they ever have. So it's funny because I think if, Indiana has some well-heeled donors, I'm not going to name them, but I think most fans know who they are. If those donors suddenly went away, then you'd have fans complaining about, well, we don't have any money to compete. So in a lot of ways, people want it both ways. But yeah, I don't think any of this is particularly good from a consumer point of view. Whereas it completely makes sense from a legal point of view. So and fans don't want to hear about legal stuff, no matter what it is, whether it's pro sports or college sports, that stuff is frankly kind of boring. And it wears people out because they have to continue to kind of recalibrate what college athletics is. So I could totally see the consternation. Unfortunately, until there's some guardrails put in, and I don't see any guardrails that are binding for other than the House settlement for a little while. That's what we got.
Yeah, I mean, I feel it too, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I would guess. I mean, when it's you're going from day to day you're covering games and you're covering press conference, and then some like legal stuff gets and you got to. It's like it's a headache. Like I don't want to cover that stuff. I want to cover. I want to cover the games. I want to cover the sport. I want to cover the players. The fun stuff.
I don't mind covering it because I know it affects everything we do. But I'll tell you what, it's kind of the opposite. When you're inside of it and you're going to games all the time, you can very easily insulate yourself to the outside view of what's going on. So, for example, Miles Rice, Kanan Carlisle, you think of the guys who came into the Indiana basketball team just for this one season, as it turned out. When we're around it every day, it becomes, those guys aren't new after a certain period of time. It becomes normal. So we in the media industry get used to it. We get used to players coming and going because we're going to be there regardless. And we're there every day, or not every day, but, more so than a typical fan would be. And so for us, it kind of washes over us a little bit. But if I were a ticket buying, if I put myself in the place of being a fan where maybe I go to a game or two a year and I don't necessarily know what I'm watching, or I don't have a guy that I can latch onto or a gal on the women's teams, yeah, that's off-putting. I mean, it is. I mean, even though I agree with the legal principles involved, you'd be silly to argue otherwise. I mean, that's something that, we'll see how college athletics and the universities and the conferences and the courts, kind of, and Congress there's a push from the NCAA to codify some things at the congressional level. We'll see how successful that is, but I think there's a lot of balls in the air yet, and we'll see where it goes.
Well, let's throw one more giant change into the mix with the Indiana basketball program. Head trainer Tim Garl, 44 years, 3 or 4 years before I was born. This dude was on the sidelines, and he has not been retained by Darian DeVries and his new staff. I think it was quoted as just kind of a new slate, or kind of starting from scratch, and there may be more to it. That's where I'm going to let you go with it. But Tim Garl out after 44 years with the program.
Right. Tim Garl joined the Indiana basketball program as the head athletic trainer in 1981. He came in right after they won the 1981 championship. So even for somebody, I'm a little bit older than you. I mean, I don't have any memory of Indiana basketball without Tim Garl on the sideline. A player gets hurt, oh, what's the report from Tim Garl? I mean, I've been hearing that long before I was in the media myself. I didn't know the man. I know a lot of people did who worked at Indiana. Very well thought of, popular figure around Indiana basketball. Obviously, he worked for every coach from Bob Knight, obviously all the way through up to Mike Woodson. And when the announcement was made yesterday, and it was announced through Tim Garl's attorney, who released a statement on Tim's behalf explaining his side of the story. And in it, he said that athletic director Scott Dolson felt it was time for a reset with the new coaching staff coming in and all of that for the athletic training. And that was kind of reinforced. They did also hire a new strength and conditioning coach as well. That was confirmed yesterday. In Tim Garl's specific case, and I want to be very careful about how I approach this, I don't want to say that it was related, but Tim Garl was also named as a co-defendant in January in the Brad Bamba sexual abuse case. If you're not familiar with that, Brad Bamba was also the longtime team doctor for men's basketball into the 1990s, and several players going all the way back into the late Butch Carter's the oldest player who's joined this suit. He played in the late 70s and was on the 1980 Big Ten championship team. Have brought forth a class action suit accusing Brad Bamba of abuse in his duties as team doctor. Tim Garl was added to that suit as a co-defendant when one of the players was added in January. So again, I want to be very careful. I have nothing to suggest that those are directly related, but it should be noted though that is going on right now for Tim Garl. So many have speculated that could be a part of this. I want to be careful about not saying that, but obviously it's there. So just to make sure it's mentioned. But Tim Garl himself, very well respected in his field, and it'll be different between him and the doctor who I believe replaced Bamba, Larry Rink, who's also been a fixture on the sideline. He retired after this season. So it really will be, you look over that Indiana basketball sideline next year, you used to see some familiar faces over there, and not going to be seeing them next year. So it really will be a clean reset in terms of the visuals when you look over at the IU bench next year.
Well, there you go on that. And let's wrap it up with football. Spring football underway across the country. I believe it was earlier today, was it not? Curt Cignetti back at the podium.
Sure did. Yep. He's back.
He's back. I'm sure he's the same dude he always is. Noteworthy things from Coach Cignetti earlier today.
The noteworthy thing that came out of today's press conference is that wide receiver Tyler Morris, who transferred in from Michigan, is out for the year. He didn't mention exactly what it was, but he said he had to have season-ending surgery. So somebody who they were counting on for some depth at wide receiver. Apart from that, no other major injuries on the offensive line. Drew Evans and Khalil Benson, who came back to Indiana after spending a year at Colorado, didn't practice today, but those aren't expected to be long-term issues. And so apart from that, they're just trying to get new quarterback Fernando Mendoza worked into the system. So far, so good with him. And I was watching the running backs today. So I was watching Roman Hemby, who played at Maryland last year. He looked pretty good, I thought, to the degree that I can judge such things. I mean, I'm no football coach, but I didn't see anything obvious that struck me as bad. And it'll be interesting. They have unlike basketball, they do have a core of players coming back from last year, at least one or two at each group on each side of the ball that gives you some confidence that they can continue to be really good again next year. So, assuming they stay healthy. So, new quarterback is always a little bit of a challenge, but I think Mendoza's looked pretty good in what I've seen so far. Probably the longest look I got of him was at Pro Day a couple weeks ago, where he ended up throwing in Curtis Rourke's place because Rourke had surgery after the season. So he was throwing some pretty good deep balls. But you know what, though? I've been to a lot of spring practices over the years, and I've seen a lot of players look good in the spring who, once you got to the fall, and I'm not trying to suggest doom and gloom for IU, but I want to see it on the field like most people do. So we'll see how that goes once Mendoza and company hit the field here in the latter part of the summer. So be interesting. But so far, I mean, other than Tyler Morris getting hurt, nothing major has happened, really good or bad. So just keeping on.
Well, there you have it. Tons of good stuff from Todd Golden, Darian DeVries, and his staff coming together. The transfer portal is humming. Women's basketball update in there, and even some football, which is as popular as it's ever been at Indiana, which is always cool. Real quick on Fernando Mendoza. I mean, Curtis Rourke was so good last year, and I'm stealing the line. I'm stealing the line from Jim Harbaugh. He hates to compare because somebody always gets diminished. But what is that comparison? I mean, Rourke was really good. Is it even fair to expect Mendoza to be that good? I mean, where does he have to stack up in terms of like the Curtis Rourke scale, I guess, if you will?
Well, what we don't know about Mendoza yet is how efficient he is. That was Curtis Rourke's. I mean, Curtis Rourke very rarely threw an interception, very rarely missed receivers, didn't take that many sacks, which is something Fernando Mendoza did do at Cal last year. Now, Cal's offensive line, it probably isn't as good as what the line that they're going to put in front of Mendoza here. But that would be my question mark is how can he match Curtis Rourke's efficiency? And that's a high bar to clear because Curtis was really efficient last year and really developed a good, relationship with his receivers, Elijah Surratt in particular. Surratt's back, so that's good for Mendoza. But that would be, I want to see, those, like Curtis Rourke was so good at those back shoulder throws on the sideline, the timing routes, really, really good on RPO. We haven't really, you can't really judge RPO until you see it in a game. I mean, you could see it in practice. You could see elements of it in practice, but until you see it in anger against a defense that, isn't going to hold back, you really don't know. So, but they recruited him and they believe that he can do those things. So, right now in Cignetti, we trust. I mean, why wouldn't you believe that they can, repeat or exceed or come close to what they did last year based on the track record. So, but yeah, we'll see. I think what we do see in practice is, how accurate he is, how good his deep ball is. And so far, he's looked pretty good.
Yes, a lot can and does change when quarterbacks can actually be hit by other giant men who are angry at them and want to tear their heads off. So he is Todd Golden, man. We just covered the gamut in a little under 40 minutes. Great stuff as always, and we will be back again next week with more updates on basketball. The house settlement stuff might have a little bit more clarity come next Tuesday, and probably more spring football stuff. So keep it locked. Indiana Hoosiers on SI. Todd, thanks so much for the time.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.